All right, we are rolling, and let us go to present. And here we go. We'll start with, we'll pick up where we left off talking about ecology. And the last thing I think I introduced was the concept of a niche. And a niche is, again, it's just the set of all of the conditions under which one species can survive and propagate, where a species can survive and reproduce and maintain a population. And the example of this that I used was if you get out of quarantine and you go down to the garden center at a store like Home Depot or Lowe's, they're doing quite a bit of business. People still got to put their gardens in. And on every plant, you'll get a tag listing, how much sunlight you're supposed to give this plant, what kind of fertilizer it especially requires, how often you're supposed to water it, things like that. And everything on that plant tag you could think of as descriptions of that plant's niche, the conditions under which it will thrive and reproduce and make more plants like itself. So that's a niche. Life's a niche. And there's a distinction that we make between a fundamental niche and a realized niche. The fundamental niche is the set of conditions under which a species is capable of growing. The realized niche are conditions under which that species actually does grow, because for at least a part of the fundamental niche, a species is likely to get outcompeted. Whenever you have niches overlap, you have niche competition. And the two possible results are either that one competitor will drive the other out, or the competitors will end up sharing the niche and specializing in such a way that neither one is competing with the other. So there was a famous case study done in the 1960s on rocky coastlines in Washington State in the Pacific Northwest. And they looked at two species of barnacles. Barnacles are actually animals. They are related to crabs and shrimp and lobster. They're crustaceans, but the body is highly modified because they live permanently attached to rocks. Each one of those little gray things that looks kind of like a volcano is a barnacle. They seal up when the water is low, but when the water is high, when the tide comes in, they stick their long legs out and sweep the water, filtering out food particles into their mouths. So they are in fact crustaceans, but the anatomy has been modified quite a bit. And barnacles can't move. Once a barnacle glues its head down to a piece of rock, it is going to be there for the rest of however long its life is. So barnacles live permanently attached to rocks, and there's two species native to Pacific Rocky Coast, a species in genus Balanus, which is larger, and a genus in a smaller species in the genus Cathamalus. And this is some Balanus, and there's some Cathamalus in there as well, living together on a rock. Where they both live together, Balanus can outcompete Cathamalus. So if you look at the level between the low tide and the high tide, Balanus can live in the lower and the middle zones. Cathamalus is capable of living in the middle and the upper, but in the middle zone, Balanus outcompetes Cathamalus. Cathamalus gets shoved to the side. However, Balanus can't live in the upper intertidal zone because it dries out there. Cathamalus can, so Cathamalus lives in the upper zone where Balanus can't. So Cathamelus's fundamental niche is the middle and the upper zone. It's capable of living in both. And if you go around with a chisel and knock all of the balanus off in the middle zone, Cathamelus can colonize there and can survive and reproduce. However, its realized niche is only the upper zone because it's driven out of the middle zone by competition with balanus. So Cathamelus has a fundamental niche that is middle and upper, but it has a realized niche of upper because it can't compete with balanus in the middle. So again, the fundamental zone is all of the conditions under which a species can live, and the realized niche is all of the conditions under which a species does live, given that in part of its fundamental niche, it may have competitors that push it out. Right. Hopefully that is clear. There. Cathamelus could live in the upper and middle zones, which is its fundamental niche, but it's restricted to the upper zone by competition with balanus. That's the realized niche. That's pretty much what I just said. All right. I'm kind of embarrassed to show you this on screen, but our gas lawnmower is broken and we haven't yet gotten around to replacing it. So the lawn back behind me is rapidly starting to turn into thick underbrush. It's actually nice because we get some nice wildflowers and, you know, insect and bird life and things like that. I kind of like a messy yard. But what you would see is an example of what we call ecological succession. And that's a series of changes over time in the communities that are present in an ecosystem. So if you imagine if we started with essentially ground zero, like a plowed field that had been plowed, had the soil turned up, it was just bare soil, and then it was abandoned. Well, if you came back in a month, first you would see a bunch of small weeds and grasses growing there, kind of like what my yard looks like right now. Lots of little flowers and weeds, lots of clover and you know, henbit and chickweed and things like that, dandelions and wild garlic. If we gave it more time, we'd start seeing taller grasses, and the taller grasses would start to outcompete the small weeds. They would block their sunlight and probably put down deeper roots and be more efficient at taking water. If you came back in a year, those tall grasses would start to be replaced with shrubs and small trees. A year would be enough time for, you know, oak tree saplings. We have oaks around here for those acorns to sprout and start giving us, you know, baby trees. And then if you came back in 10 years, some of those trees would be getting increasingly tall. If you came back in 50 years, we'd have pretty large trees. And if you came back in 400 years, you'd have very dense forest. And the trees would be so tall and they'd block so much of the light that the ground would actually not have much in the way of weeds and grasses and things like that. And you could walk around pretty easily under the shade of the really tall trees that would now dominate the landscape. What that's all an example of is what we call ecological succession. If you just take an area of, you know, could be the land, could be the ocean, whatever it is, and you simply leave it alone, one by one, species will start growing, they'll propagate for a while, eventually they may get replaced by something else, and one community after another community will replace community over time. That's succession. This is what a land ecosystem would look like if you leave it alone completely. This is a place that I've visited that I highly recommend if you ever get out to the San Francisco area. This is Muir Woods in California, and it's dominated by redwood trees that get over 300 feet tall, almost 100 meters. If you walk around, it's amazing. It looks like walking in a giant cathedral, and there's not a lot of growth on the forest floor. There's not a lot of weeds and grasses and vines and things like that, because the redwoods are so tall and they're so efficient at blocking out the light that there's not a lot of what we call understory. This is what you get when you take land and you don't mess with it for at least hundreds of years. And we call this a climax community. A climax community is basically where succession finally comes to an end. If you haven't been out of Arkansas, you might not have been in a climax community. In the United States, almost all of our climax forests, what we call old growth forests, were cut down many years ago. I'm not sure there's any old growth forest left in the state of Arkansas. Most of what we have is what we call secondary growth forest. But if, I don't know, I almost said if Arkansas was depopulated, and then I thought that was probably really too depressing. But let's say if we could leave my yard alone for 500 years, we might reach the kind of mixed oak, old growth forest that we used to have before humans came. So a climax community is the end point of succession. And we can see it happening, and we can distinguish between what we call primary and secondary succession. Primary succession is what you observe in a location where there's never been any life. Here's some primary succession beginning. This is a volcano that had been erupting under the ocean for thousands of years and finally broke the surface of the ocean in 1963 off the coast of Iceland. They named it Surtsey. Not that you care, but A means an island, and Surt is the fire giant in Norse mythology. And in 1963, as it was erupting, it was essentially barren. You know, not even extremophile Archeans could actually live in lava or in the ash that was pouring out, the fragments of rock that make up what looks like white smoke there. So when it arose out of the ocean in eruptions over the course of about half a year, it was as close to a sterile environment as you can get. There was nothing living on it. But once the eruption stopped, the island was made a preserve. People are not allowed to visit it except for accredited researchers. And what they've been doing is simply watching the place. And that's what Surtsey looks like now. What happened was that seeds of some plants would be blown from the Icelandic mainland to Surtsey by wind. Some of them would wash up because they float. They actually found a tree trunk with soil still trapped in the roots that floated from Iceland over to Surtsey, and it introduced not just plant seeds, but insects and slugs and things like that. There were other insects that got blown over by wind. Birds, of course, can fly, so they started settling on Surtsey about as soon as it cooled down. Seagulls and puffins and skuas and other Arctic birds like that. Some birds that had eaten fruit pooped out seeds on Surtsey. And today there's over 60 species of plant there. There's 15 species of birds that are known to nest there. And it's actually considering that it's up in the damn Arctic, it's a fairly rich ecosystem. with insects, slugs. They found earthworms recently. The rocky shores have seaweeds and marine life, snails and clams. And of course, they get seals and sea lions and things like that. And so there's been a series of primary succession stages going on Surtsey, where there was never any life until the volcano stopped erupting. You're starting from absolute, zero right there, starting from nothing. You get primary succession taking place. On the other hand, secondary succession is ecological succession in a region that may have been disturbed, but that's never been sterile. This happens to be an abandoned farm field in Canada. And while the farm was active, the place was certainly plowed and the soil was disturbed. But there was always microbial life in the soils. There were always seeds in the soil. There were probably always earthworms and insects and things like that in the soil. The place was disturbed, but it never went back all the way to square one. And what's going on there now is early stages of secondary succession, when the field is getting overgrown by, this is still early, so we're mostly just seeing weeds and wildflowers and small plants. Looks like a lot of goldenrod from where I'm sitting. This is what my backyard is going through. In fact, what the heck? I'm embarrassed by how bad a housekeeper I am. But if you want to see early stages of secondary succession, here we go. Yeah, I'm going to, just a sec. Let's see. Take this out. And there. I don't know if you can see that, but that's what my yard looks like right now. There's a lot of vetch that I'm seeing. I'm spotting some chickweed. Farther downhill, there's some periwinkle that the previous owners planted and things like that. But yeah, that is early stages of secondary succession, with later stages visible in the background because we've got some forest on the property. So there. And yeah, apologies again for my terrible track record of maintaining a yard. All right, any questions, any comments? Everybody happy? I'm explaining this so well that you're all going to ace the final. I'll take that as a yes. All right. And back to the slides. Now, you might remember, if you were here, that in the last lecture, I talked about R and K as being the abbreviations for numbers that we use to model population growth. R is the intrinsic rate of increase, and K is the carrying capacity. And species can be in between, but it's useful to talk about some species being more R-selected and some being more K-selected. R-selected species, remember, reproduce fast. They've got a high rate of increase, but they don't invest a great deal of energy in each offspring. So an R-selected plant might make many thousands of seeds, but not put a lot of nutrition into each seed and just scatter them randomly. A K-selected plant might make a lot fewer seeds, but might put more nutrients into each one so that each individual sprout has a better chance of survival. So do you invest in lots of offspring, but not much in each one, or fewer offspring, but more in each one? There's no single right answer. Different strategies work in different situations. And in succession, our selected species are often the first to appear because they spread rapidly, reproduce abundantly. They can quickly grab onto a habitat that is open and get a foothold very early and take it over. You see this a lot in prairies. This is a bit of Arkansas prairie. That flower is one of our native species of coneflower, genus Echinacea, by the way. And it produces lots of seeds, and so do the grasses and things that you see. They tend to be more R-selected. K-selected species tend to move in later. They can't reproduce as fast, so they can't spread into a disturbed area quickly, but they can establish, sometimes literally, deeper roots. They can eventually outcompete the R-selected species using a strategy that's more, slow and steady instead of, rapid takeovers. Now, the R-selected species can survive because if you're in a place like Arkansas prairie, you never quite reach the climax community because in Arkansas, left to its own devices, we have periodic fires. So in that natural area that you see, the prairie that you're looking at might eventually grow up to be forest, but at the same time, the forest that you see in the background might burn down and become prairie again. So you have this dynamic mixture of older and newer areas of succession. So there's pretty much always some space for the R-selected species. There's always room for them to move in an area that has freshly been disturbed. There's some more Arkansas prairie. This is the Cherokee Prairie Natural Area out in western Arkansas. Of course, if you've done Lab 12 or if you've watched the videos, you've seen what the prairie looks like in the Jewel Moore Nature Reserve on the UCA campus. And to keep that prairie, we actually have to burn it every couple of years because prairie is maintained by repeated disturbance. If prairie were never burned off, it would eventually turn into old growth forest. What keeps it prairie is the fact that it periodically burns. That gets rid of trees and provides new area for those R-selected grasses and wildflowers and things like that to move in. And prairie plants are often very well adapted to this sort of thing. They may have fire-resistant seeds. In some cases, they may have fire-resistant roots that can grow back very quickly afterwards. So plants in a prairie community are able to withstand these periodic disturbances and come back again. But those repeated wildfires are what keep a piece of the prairie. They keep it prairie. They keep it from turning into something else. Ecological succession never manages to go very far on a prairie. Before the arrival of humans, prairies were maintained by fires caused by lightning. Native Americans were known to deliberately set prairie fires because their lifestyle was well adapted to life on a prairie. Today, prairies are often deliberately burned in order to keep them from going through succession all the way into forest. And as I mentioned, the UCA prairie is burned every couple of years. If you come back to campus, they usually do it in December. I don't know when they're going to do it next, but if you get back to UCA, you might see the burned off prairie in December, and it comes back again pretty nicely in spring and summer. Just another example that I remember very well, if you go into the southern and central California hills of what they call the Coast Ranges, The land around where I went to grad school in the People's Republic of Berkeley, California, the areas that aren't built up look like this. You have a mixture of grasses. You have some, small flowers and things like that, mixed with short, scrubby, short oak trees and some scrubby pines and things like that. You have some bushes with that, like Arctostaphylos. They call it bearberry. And you have a plant community that's called chaparral. And this is typical of the hills of Southern and Central California. And it's another ecosystem that is accustomed to periodic burning. The roots of plants like bearberry can survive wildfire. Even if the top of the plant burns off, the roots can come back and grow new stems and leaves. The seeds may be able to survive in the soil and then come right back after the burning is over. So chaparral normally burns off. This is usually not a problem, except for one thing. People really, 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 really like building their houses where you get a view like this. The climate is very pleasant for almost all of the year. And, dude, it's California, man. So a lot of people have built houses in communities like this. And I remember this really well because I had just started grad school and I was living about a mile from where this happened. What had happened was that the cities had spread into the chaparral community. And naturally, when you build houses, you don't want fires. So wildfires were suppressed in that area. They'd have fire departments coming and, putting them out. And so what was happening in, even in people's backyards, but especially in parks and things like that, was that dead vegetation was building up because there wasn't any fire to get rid of them, which is what normally would happen. So the amount of fuel built up, and eventually it caught on fire and resulted in the Oakland firestorm of October 1991. If you're sports fans, I don't know if you've ever seen this. I'm sure you can find it on YouTube. But this happened to break out in the middle of a World Series game. I think it was the Giants playing the A's at what used to be called Candlestick Park. Now it's, I don't know, Google Park or something, because Google owns everything down there now. But it actually forced cancellation of the game because so much smoke was drifting across the bay that it was interfering with play. And the end result was 25 people died and 3,000 homes were lost, including the homes of at least one person that I worked with at the time. And that's an example of what happens when you take an ecosystem that is adapted for periodic fires and you don't let it burn. You repress it. You can repress it for a while, but eventually you'll get a really big burn that was really difficult for the firefighters to manage to put it out, and you got a lot of property destruction. What they started doing in the aftermath of that was changing building codes, requiring landowners to clear away brush. The county actually maintained a herd of goats that would come in and eat excess vegetation on your property. Changing some building codes so you no longer could have too many plants growing close to your house, things like that. So hopefully things will, hopefully the next time this happens, things will be better. But the principle is still the same, that if you repress that burning, you end up with serious damage when the fire finally does break out. Better to go with the flow, man. This is California, dude. Okay, everybody happy? We have questions, problems? If you don't feel like talking, you can chat. I can hear the beep, and I'll answer if I can.
Can I ask a quiz?
Yes, about the quiz.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it should appear on Blackboard at, well, it will be noon here. So I guess it will be about 2 in the morning where you are.
Oh, yeah, I know.
But you will have 24 hours to take it. So
Mhm.
you can take it at any time tomorrow. The
Okay.
format will be 5 short answer questions. Once you start taking it, you'll only have 10 minutes. So you need to make sure you're rested and comfortable and ready.
Do you cover the ecology or?
Not yet. The
Well,
quiz will be entirely on cells.
okay, thank you.
The quizzes next week will cover ecology, however.
Okay, gotcha.
Okay. Anybody else? Okay, right. When you've got an ecosystem, you can look at the way in which biomass and energy move through that ecosystem. Now, energy moves through an ecosystem basically by eating, right? Plants suck up sunlight and small molecules, and they make that into plant material. Let's say an insect might eat the plant and will get energy from the plant food. And then let's say a bird might eat the insect and get energy from eating the insect. And then I'm just looking around here. I'm not seeing him right now, but we actually have owls on the property. We have barred owls on our land. And one of these owls might eat the small bird and get energy from eating it. So energy tends to move through ecosystems as everything is eaten by something else. We can also talk about biomass doing the same thing. And biomass is not on this slide. Biomass just means living matter. You know, what every living thing is made of is its biomass. And so plants produce biomass because they take carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight and use it to make more plant stuff. And then the insect gets not only energy when it eats the plant, it gets biomass as well. It gets the molecules that it needs to build up itself, to build its own body. And then the small bird eating the insect will get biomass as well as energy from it. And the barred owl eating the small bird that's eating the insect that's eating the plant will also get both biomass and energy from eating it. I don't know how many of you are familiar with barred owls. If you're awake early in the morning, you can sometimes hear them going, woo, 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 woo. We say that what they're saying is, who cooks for you? But it sounds more like, woo, 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 woo. Right, there's my owl impression. So when we look at the flow of energy and biomass, this is a simplification, but we can divide it into several levels of energy flow. And we call these trophic levels. Trophane is Greek for to feed or to eat. So trophic levels just means eating levels. The primary producers in the ecosystem, often it's plants. In some ecosystems, it might also be bacteria or something like that. But certainly in your typical land ecosystem, it would be the plants. They're the ones that make biomass by taking simple molecules and building them up into sugars and carbohydrates and lipids and everything like that. And we call those the primary producers, or what they do is the primary productivity. The critters, usually it would be animals in the ecosystems that you're familiar with, The critters that feed on the producers directly would be primary consumers, aka herbivores, because they eat plants. Secondary consumers would feed on the primary consumers. So in the example I gave, the small bird eating the insect would be a secondary consumer. Tertiary consumers would feed on the secondary consumers. So in the example that I gave, the owl eating the bird, eating the insect, would be a tertiary consumer. And then my little example stopped there. But if you have consumers that eat the tertiaries, you'd call them quaternary consumers. Some ecosystems might have fewer levels than this. Some might have more. There are some ecosystems out in the open ocean that might have as many as 9 trophic levels. There are also some that might have as few as 2. There's primary producers and primary consumers, maybe 3, and that's as much as it gets. So ecosystems vary. There aren't always 4, and sometimes there's more than 4 levels of consumers. And of course, many organisms might occupy more than one level. We don't have them on our property, I don't think. I hope not. But if we had wild pigs on the property, they'll happily eat vegetation, but they'll also scavenge small animals if they get the chance. Bears will eat meat, but they'll also eat certain plants, and they'll also eat certain plant products like honey, given the chance. And humans, of course, might eat just about anything. We eat plants, we eat primary consumers, and we might eat secondary consumers as well. So many organisms might occupy more than one level. We're simplifying things here, but it'll do for what I need to show you guys. So on a prairie, you might have plants as primary producers, and then on the left, that's a grasshopper eating the plant would be a primary consumer. And then a mouse eating the grasshopper would be a secondary consumer. And then that's a rattlesnake eating the mouse would be a tertiary consumer. And then a red-tailed hawk, which we also have around here, eating the rattlesnake that ate the mouse, that ate the insect, that ate the plant. That hawk would be a quaternary consumer. And then you have similar things in the ocean. The primary producers in much of the ocean are single-celled little protists and bacteria. The critters that eat those are small animals collectively called zooplankton, things like little shrimp relatives and larval fish and things like that. And then you might have secondary consumers would be, let's say, mackerel fish eating the zooplankton. That tertiary consumer is a tuna. Tunas eat secondary consumers. They're predatory. And then the quaternary consumer might be the orca right there, the so-called killer whale, that doesn't have any natural predators, except for like SeaWorld. But aside from humans, there's really nothing that can regularly kill and eat an orca. That's the end of what we call the food chain, or the trophic chain. And again, these have 1 level of producers and 4 levels of consumers. In the real world, there could be less or more levels than that. Imagine for a moment you could take the amount of biomass in an ecosystem and weigh it. Imagine we could take, say in my backyard, we could pluck up every plant and put all of them on a great big scale. We wouldn't really do that for a large area, but maybe for a small area we could. So we could calculate the amount of biomass in my backyard, the total weight of all of the plants that are growing in it. And then let's say we could somehow collect every insect and every little, seed-eating bird and things like that, and weigh that. We could get the mass of primary consumers. We could calculate their biomass. And then if we weighed all of the secondary consumers, we could get their biomass. And then if we weighed, all of the owls on the property, we'd have the biomass at the tertiary level. So imagine if we could separate out every organism from each trophic level and weigh it and represent the total mass by a bar. We could stack the bars on top of each other and we'd get a diagram called a trophic pyramid. All this is saying is the higher up that chain you go, the less biomass is available. We might have, I don't know, on this hill where I'm sitting, I'll just guess, we might have 10,000 kilograms of plants growing on this hill in my neighbor's yards. That might be enough to support, let's say, 1,000 kilograms worth of insects. That might be enough to support 100 kilograms worth of, insect-eating birds and mice and things like that, which might be enough to support 10 kilograms worth of owls and hawks. Okay, so the higher up you go in the pyramid, the less biomass you have. And if you diagram that, you get a diagram called a trophic pyramid. And the reason you get this is that whenever you transfer energy and biomass from one trophic level to another, a lot gets lost. Why? Well, first of all, metabolism is never 100% efficient. You never get all of the energy that you're theoretically capable of getting from your food. Some of it your body just can't assimilate. Some of that biomass is lost because it can't be digested. The exoskeletons of insects and the tough cellulose of plants is excreted out by animals. They can't digest it, so it comes out in the poop. And then a lot of metabolic energy ends up getting lost in the form of heat. Some of the energy that I got from my last meal is right now radiating out into space because it's nice and cool and my body temperature is nice and warm. So I'm giving off energy into the environment right now, and that energy is not going into new growth. A lot of biomass and energy is also just used for maintenance. It's used for replacing, you have to replace something like 100 million cells every day. So some of your biomass goes to that. Some of your biomass just goes to energy that ultimately is lost to the surroundings. So metabolism's never 100% efficient, and most of the matter that a consumer eats goes into things other than making new biomass. And in fact, the ecological efficiency of each trophic level averages about 10%. In some cases, it's more, in some, it's less. 10% is a good rule of thumb. Sorry, I just assimilated biomass by swallowing a bug. Excuse me. Right. And if I just swallowed that bug, only about 10% of the mass of the bug is going to go into making more of me. The rest is going to be lost. And the proportion of a biomass at a lower level that is transferred to a higher level is called the ecological efficiency. And a good rule of thumb is it's about 10%. So in the example that I gave, we might have 10,000 kilograms of plant matter growing on Squirrel Hill, where I live. And it might support 1,000 kilograms of bugs if we could somehow vacuum them all up and weigh them And that might support 100 kilograms of bug-eating birds and rodents and things like that, which might be enough to support 10 kilograms worth of owls and hawks. There's a diagram of what a trophic pyramid might look like for an ocean ecosystem. And it's the same thing. That lower bar says that you might get 1 million kilograms of single-celled photosynthetic protists and bacteria, the phytoplankton. One area of ocean might produce 1 million kilograms of those, which might support 100,000 kilograms of microscopic little shrimpies and things, which might support 10,000 kilograms of shrimp, which might support 1,000 kilos of big fish, which might support 100 kilos of shark. So the rule of thumb is each level of that pyramid is 1/10 the size of the level below. And in the real world, it can be a little more, it can be a bit less, but 1/10 is a good average. The reason this matters practically is that it leads to something called biological magnification. Back in the 50s, we used an insecticide called dichloro-diphenyl trichloroethane, or DDT. You can just say DDT, that's fine. DDT was sprayed on fields. They used to cut down on mosquitoes by just spraying it into the air. Some people can still remember DDT trucks in the streets. And DDT doesn't break down very easily, so it would tend to wash into the water of ponds, lakes, and rivers. Now, the concentration of DDT in the water was extremely low. On the left, that ppm stands for parts per million. So you only had a very tiny fraction of 1/1,000,000th bug again of that water was DDT, almost undetectable. The problem is that little microscopic protists growing in the water tended to take up DDT from the water. Those little microscopic protists got eaten by little shrimpy things, the zooplankton. And because every zooplankton needs to eat hundreds or thousands of little single-cell protists in order to live, every zooplankton ended up with a much higher dose of DDT in its tissues. DDT tends to build up in bodies. Organisms can't easily break it down, and they can't easily excrete it. It tends to just sit in your fat and stay there. So even though there was very little DDT in the water, because every little zooplankton, every little shrimpy thing has to eat thousands of little protists, every little shrimpy thing built up a much higher concentration of DDT. And then every little fish has to eat hundreds of zooplankton to live. And so every little fish gets an even bigger dose of DDT. Every big fish has to eat hundreds of little fish in order to survive. So the dose inside bigger fish was even greater. We're up to 2 parts per million. And then by the time you get to fish-eating birds like bald eagles and ospreys, every bald eagle was building up a concentration of DDT up to 25 parts per million. The concentration of DDT increased by a factor of 10 million times between just the water and the tissues of eagles and ospreys, the fish-eating birds that were at the top of the trophic pyramid. The reason that mattered is that when you have that much DDT, it affects the bird's metabolism. Specifically, it ruins the bird's ability to make eggshells. Eagles and ospreys were laying eggs that would break the instant they came out because they were being laid with very weak eggshells. And because of this, the bald eagle, the national symbol of the United States, was endangered in all of the US except for the state of Alaska, where DDT wasn't used nearly as much because they don't have nearly as much agriculture. DDT was banned in the 1950s, partly because pest insects were building up tolerance to it because of our old friend natural selection, but partly because it was killing, endangered birds of prey. And thanks to this, the bald eagles made a comeback. It's not that unusual to see them in central Arkansas now. Sometimes they nest in Lake Conway. One year they actually nested in a tree on the house of a friend of mine. So they've made a great comeback since DDT was banned. But the reason DDT was a problem was a phenomenon called biological magnification, and that ultimately results from the trophic pyramid. The fact that consumers at each level have to eat a much higher mass of the consumers at the lower level in order to sustain themselves. It's also the reason why there are advisories about eating mercury, which follows the same rules. Mercury tends to build up. You can't break it down, and it's not easily excreted, so it tends to build up over the course of your life. Now, there's mercury in ocean water. Some of it is there naturally. Some of it is a pollutant released by burning coal. Coal has some mercury in it that ends up in the atmosphere when you burn the coal and ultimately in the water. But there's some in it naturally anyway. Every little single-celled protist will pick up only a very tiny trace of mercury, but every little zooplankton has to eat many thousands of little protists, and every tiny fish has to eat thousands of zooplankton, and every medium fish has to eat thousands of smaller fish, and every really big fish has to eat thousands of medium fish. And so concentrations of mercury build up the higher you go up that trophic pyramid. The current advisory is that pregnant and nursing women and young children are at the greatest risk of damage from mercury poisoning. I mean, enough mercury will harm anybody, but it's especially dangerous in fetuses and infants because their brain's not fully developed yet. And so the advisory is for pregnant and nursing women to avoid shark and swordfish and limit their consumption of tuna. The reason is that those fish are high-level consumers. That's a tuna right there, that big fish, if you didn't know. And those are the fish that are likeliest to contain potentially hazardous levels of mercury. So, yeah, if you are eating sushi, it is probably safest to not always get the tuna and sometimes get something that's farther down on the trophic pyramid, like maybe mackerel. I think that's saba. I could be wrong. Or unagi is really good. Unagi should be safer. Right. So last concept I want to introduce. We've talked about how organisms feed each other, and that sets up that trophic pyramid. But organisms can relate to each other without eating each other. One way that they do that is, of course, symbiosis, and we talked about that earlier. But there's other ways that aren't nearly as tight as a symbiotic relationship, but that are still important. So here's an example. This is a rodent that used to be a lot more common in North America. Genus Cynomys, common name is prairie dog, although it's not really a dog. It's a rodent. It's related to rats and mice. And prairie dogs live in big colonies, and they dig these great networks of burrows on the prairie, big enough that they call them prairie dog towns, with chambers and passages. They can take up, I'm not sure how big the largest one is, They used to have one at the Little Rock Zoo that was easily 10 meters across, maybe more than that. So these can be pretty large. Well, prairie dogs are part of the trophic pyramid. They do get eaten by birds of prey, for example, but prairie dogs affect other life forms in other ways. This is a burrowing owl. Despite the name, they're not very good at digging burrows. They don't dig their own. What they do is they use old prairie dog burrows to build their nest in. So they don't really eat prairie dogs, but they depend on them. And prairie dogs are a great example of what's called a keystone species. And this is the last thing I'm going to introduce. A keystone species is one that has a very large effect on the ecosystem out of proportion to its numbers. The loss of a keystone species ripples through an ecosystem and changes every aspect of it, changes the ecosystem fundamentally. Prairie dogs are a keystone species because an awful lot of other prairie species depend on them. And if prairie dogs aren't there, the ecosystem radically changes. In some cases, the keystone species is an apex predator, meaning the top of the trophic pyramid. Whatever predator there is that eats whatever it wants to and nothing eats it. But it doesn't have to be. The metaphor is a reference to the keystone of an arch. There's an arch. I don't know if you can see my animations, but there's an arrow pointing to that gray trapezoid-shaped stone at the top of that arch on the UCA campus. And that keystone, that top stone, is locking the entire arch in place. You could actually build one without mortar, simply because the downward force on the keystone gets transmitted into forces that lock all of those arch blocks together. But if you pull the keystone out, the entire arch falls down. You know, take out the keystone and the whole thing collapses. That's similar to what keystone species are like. So, great example. Yellowstone National Park, mostly in the state of Wyoming. There used to be wolves there. They had been wiped out decades ago, but they were reintroduced in 1995. There were a lot of objections from ranchers. There's a lot of cattle ranching out there, and they felt the wolves would kill their cows. But what the wolves mostly eat in the park is elk. American elk, not the same as European elk. American elk are basically really big deer. There you've got a wolf pack taking out an elk. When the wolves were introduced, the elk started moving away from them, and they started moving to higher ground, and they moved away from the river valleys. So now elk are no longer grazing in the river valleys, and that allows riverside plants like willows and aspen trees to move into the river valleys now that the elk are no longer grazing on them. That creates habitat for animals by the riversides, like beavers and like moose, called elk in Europe, but in America we call them moose. And then elk killed by wolves are a source of food from bald eagles to magpies, that's that bird on the right, to ravens, to grizzly bears. So because the wolves are there, you have habitat for riverside plants and riverside animals, and you have a food source for the scavengers. And if you took the wolves away, all of those changes would reverse. You get a very different ecosystem, and probably a much richer one, because the wolves are there. The wolves are a great example of a keystone species. And in this case, the wolves are also the apex predator, but they don't have to be. Prairie dogs are a prairie keystone species because those burrows get used by burrowing owls, as we've seen. The burrows get used by lizards and rabbits. The prairie dogs get eaten by foxes and ferrets, like weasels, hawks, badgers, mean critters, badgers are. And they affect the community in more diverse ways. That burrowing that they do increases the soil's ability to soak up water. That means more plants can grow. That means that more grazing animals can live there. That loosening of the soil that they do also attracts insects, and insect-eating birds can eat them. So not just by eating and being eaten in the food chain, but by their other life activities, the prairie dogs make life possible for a very wide range of species, everything from plants to owls. And that makes them a keystone species. If you wipe out the prairie dogs, you radically transform that ecosystem. Species might go extinct or become endangered if prairie dogs aren't there. The whole plant community changes. That whole prairie ecosystem in North America is dependent on prairie dogs, like an arch depends on a keystone. Okay, that's it for the slides. Are there any questions before I stop recording? Okay, I will take that as a no questions, and I will assume that I just taught that with absolute shining clarity. And I will stop recording now.